So now that we've taken some time to look at arrays, or what we call lists, so in the AP exam they'll refer to it as a list. We in computer science we typically call them arrays. So we've looked at that. We did the temps array where you hard code two arrays with the temperatures for the week. One of them the highs and the other one the lows for the week. And then you ask the user to ask basically what day of the week they want a temperature for, and you produce that. Now I want to just kind of expand on the previous tutorial, which had to do with traversing arrays. So I want to do a few things here. I want to just make sure that is clear, and also talk a little bit about the assignment that follows up to this tutorial video. So suppose you have an array, in this case, just any array. It can have anything in it. You can choose. So let's just start here with scores, where maybe your scores array basically has the scores for your, or actually, you don't want, let me call it grades. I think that's a little more appropriate here. It has the grades for each of your classes. And these are as a percentage out of 100. So 89, and then maybe 87, and then 95. And let's just say you have 4 classes, and then you're not doing all that great on that last one, 73. Now we can hard code these values. We can write them in like we just did, or we can actually prompt the user to give us these values. What we need to do here when we prompt the user, we need to ask the user, hey, what's the grade in your first class? And they'll enter it. And what's the grade in your second class? They'll enter that. Very much like the Gpa Calculator application that you built previously. However, whereas in the Gpa Calculator, you stored each grade in a separate variable. So you said grade 1 equals what the user inputs. And you ask enter the grade or enter grade for next class. I'll just call it next. Now recall that because this is going to be a numeric value, we would need to pass it through the int function to make it an integer. And so before we ask for each grade, and you would replicate this. So I would copy this and then just paste it multiple times for each grade. That should be indented. Let me do this. And you would just change the grade 1 to grade 2 and 3 and 4, right? But and so that's how we went about asking for all these grades, and then we use those to get the GPA for someone. Now we want to store them in the same variable in grades, where grades is now an array. You can store multiple numbers in it. And so we don't take this, well, we don't do this exactly, but what we could do is we could say grades of 0. That would be the first grade, is whatever the user enters, and then grades of 1, and then grades of 2. Notice that we're doing the same thing where we're asking for a grade, but now we're not storing it in 3 separate variables. We're storing them in the same variable, grades, which is an array of integers or a list of whole numbers. And we would do one more because we have 4 grades, where this would be grades of 3. Like that. So now if I run this, it says enter the grade for the next class. Notice that initially I actually put 4 grades in here, but if I put values in here, they're going to be replaced. So the 89, which is the first grade in my list, would now be replaced with 75. Let's say I put 75, and then the 87 would be replaced with the 90. The 95 would be replaced with an 87, and the 73 at the end would be replaced with a 91. Obviously, I'm making these numbers up, okay? So don't worry about why they are that. But that's what happened here on lines 7 through 10. Now, what the problem here then becomes is, well, what happens if the user has 6 classes, not 4? Well, then you would want 2 more of these input statements. So if the user had 6, I would want 2 more, where I would then say grades of 4 and grades of 5. Notice that it's 6 grades, but because you start counting at 0, meaning the first index value is 0, the last index value will be 5. And so you want your code to be reactive. You don't want to have to, every time the user picks between 4 classes or 6 classes, you don't want to have to come in here and manually add or delete these last 2 prompts. And that's why we use loops. Just bear with me here a minute. So let's consider here the case where we want to make this fully autonomous, meaning we want the user to figure out how many grades they want to enter. Well, the first thing I would consider doing is maybe not initializing these grades. And so what we can do is we can say, let's say that all the grades in the list, let's just set them initially to 0. Let's put a 0. And then let's say that I want 6 grades. Then I would multiply this. The notation would be such that I would multiply this times 6. And what this does, it is the equivalent of writing a list with 6 zeros in it. So 6. There it is. So it does the same exact thing. So now right here, this multiplying by 6 means I want a list of zeros, and specifically 6 zeros. And if I wanted 4, I would multiply by 4 instead. Now this is now convenient because we start finding a way to make this a process that is fully automated. So let's work on this, okay? Let's first ask the user how many classes they're enrolled in. I'll say here num classes equals, and I'll copy one of these. And so I'll say enter number of classes. So there are some seniors that only take 4 classes, right? Now that is going to be stored in the variable num classes. So if I run this and I put 6 classes, well, it should ask me for 6 grades, 90, 90, 90. And it does. Notice how it asks me for 6 grades. Great. That works fine. But if I run this again and I put 4 classes, for those of you who are unscheduled after lunch, my current implementation still is going to ask me 6 times. And that's because I have 6 input statements here. In addition, grades, which is a list or an array, will have 6 zeros to begin with. And each one of those zeros will be replaced with whatever you enter over here. So what I want to do is that I want to multiply grades by 6. I want to multiply it by the number of classes, whatever the user enters. So if the user enters the number 4, you would have 4 zeros instead of 6 zeros, which means that I would not have those right there, right? And that means that then I would only want to ask for 4 grades. And so if we put 4 here, 90, 90, 90, and 90, it works. But then now I run into the problem that I had before, where if I enter 6, it's still just going to ask me 4 times. And so that's where looping gets, that's where looping comes into play. I'm going to start with the while loop. I'm going to use this variable I, which is going to be the index value, 0, and then 1, and then 2, and then 3. And then I'm going to say that while I is less than, well, the last number that I want for I is 3. And if I can retrieve the number of elements in my list using the len method or function as such. So basically this says get the length of grades. How many elements does grades have? Well, it's going to have, in this case, four zeros. And so we're going to go until I is still less than 4. And that means 3. I will be 3. Or if you want, because we use num classes to basically give the array a length, we could say until I is less than num classes. Either way works. And then I can actually just have one of these in here, just one, where I replace the index. So I'm not going to put here 0 because then I would always put the grade in the first location right here, just there. So instead I'm going to put I. And then after, I'm going to increase I by 1. So then I will be 1 and then 2 and 3, and this is changing, constantly changing as I loop. And so if I run this, now it is fully autonomous. If I put three classes, notice that at this point, enter grade for the next class, I entered my loop right here. Num classes is 3. That's why I entered. So that's stored here. That means that I made a list with 3 zeros in it only. And when I enter this first grade, 85, that is stored in grades of 0. So this would be 85. And now that I'm being asked for the second grade, if I put 90, that is stored in grades of 1. So that's stored here, 90. Nope. And then finally, one more time, I'm going to ask here. So I'll put 75. And that is stored here in the third grade. Notice that this right here is not there because I only entered 3 classes. And if I want to verify that this worked correctly, I can use a separate loop where I'm going to actually talk about a for loop for every grade. So I'll call this for every grade. So G, for every G in grades, I just want to print that grade, print G. So a different way of traversing an array. So that's what we're actually focusing our attention right now on, and that's the fact that we can use loops to traverse an array. So in this case, we're using a while loop. And specifically, we're populating the array. We're putting numbers into our array, whereas over here, I'm using a for loop to traverse the array again. And if I run this, and I put here 4 classes, and I'll put here 90, 92, 80, 74, and 82. Notice that it populates my array here. And then on line 19, I print G, where G is every number in grades. And so G will be 90. And then when I loop again, G will be 92, and then 74, and then 82. If I was to do this, print this for loop, if I was to do it here, right after I put here grades is an array of zeros, then it's going to print all zeros. G is going to be zeros because this is where I populate the array with zeros. If I put ones here, then it's going to be full of ones. If I put any number, really, 90, it's going to be however many classes you have, they're going to be all 90s. 0 is probably as good a number as any because there's no reason why to put another one, any other number than 0. If I run this now, and I'm just going to use 3 classes here, notice how it prints. So I ask for the number of classes, that's 3. I multiply 3 times an array of zeros. That gives me an array that has 3 zeros within. For every G in grades, That means every element in grades, print whatever that element is. Right now there's zeros, so it prints all zeros. And then we get to this line here on line 18 where we say enter the grade for the next class. That's because I is 0 and 0 is less than 3. So we print this. We enter a 90, and then I enter an 87, and then a 20. And now when I print every grade, every element G in grades, now it's these new values 90, 87, and 20. So these zeros have been replaced with these numbers. Finally, let's do the GPA calculator here to give this a little bit of just completeness. You know what? I'm going to make that an assignment. You can start with this. Let me just talk a little bit about what you might need here. When you ask for a grade, notice that you're given a grade in terms of a percentage out of 100. But when you calculate a GPA, you have to use the grade points 4, 3, 2, and 1, depending on this grade. That means that somewhere in your code, and maybe you can do this right here. So instead of printing G, maybe you can add those grade points. So where G is every element in grades, if G is greater than or equal to 90, then that corresponds to a 4. Or if G is greater than or equal to an 80, that corresponds to a 3. So make sure you go through the process. At the end, I want you to print the GPA for a student. Basically your GPA calculator, but now we're using arrays instead of using separate variables for each grade. That's going to be your task.